But if you would, before you turn there, turn back to Exodus chapter 16. Exodus chapter 16. So if you recall, in Exodus, this would be when the children of Israel are in the wilderness. They have begun their journey in the wilderness after escaping Egypt, or I should say being delivered from Egypt. And we pick up in verse 1 of Exodus chapter 16. The entire Israelite community departed from Elim and came to the wilderness of Sin, which is between Elim and Sinai, on the 15th day of the second month after they had left the land of Egypt. The entire Israelite community grumbled against Moses and Aaron in the wilderness. The Israelites said to them, "If only we had died by the Lord's hand in the land of Egypt, when we sat by pots of meat and ate all the bread we wanted. Instead, you brought us into this wilderness to make this whole assembly die of hunger." Then the Lord said to Moses, "I'm going to rain bread from heaven for you. The people are going to go out each day and gather enough for that day. This way I will test them to see whether or not they will follow my instructions." Okay, so the children of Israel have been brought out into the wilderness. We're now in the second month after they've been brought out. And they begin to grumble against God. Now keep in mind, they have left Egypt plundered. The Egyptians showered things on them to get them to leave faster, basically. And so now they're out into the wilderness, and presumably, I'm guessing, supplies are starting to run out and have become scarce. And so they are grumbling because there's not much food and there's not much water. We'll see that later on. But what God says in the face of this grumbling, first of all, their grumbling is against Moses and Aaron. But what God says in the face of this grumbling, because really it's against him, ultimately, is I'm going to shower down a blessing of bread on these people. And not just a small portion of bread, but enough bread that they can gather it and be filled for each and every day. And he'll go on in this chapter to give instructions about how they're going to do that and how that provision is going to continue. Okay, so we see the reaction of the people. Now, what we know about this story, if we've continued to read along, is that God does continue to provide for them, and they grow tired of it. This manna that you've given us sticks in our throat. We're so tired of it. This is a blessing from God that's sustaining them and keeping them alive. They don't have to work for it. They don't have to do anything but go out and just reap it. And they're complaining against God for it. So now turn over into Deuteronomy chapter 8. Deuteronomy chapter 8. So Deuteronomy 8, we've come to the end of the wilderness wandering. We're in this next generation. So the first generation we just read about in Exodus 16 was those who were originally delivered from Egypt. Deuteronomy chapter 8 is now the children of that generation because, again, their parents complained. They died out in the wilderness due to their sin. And so they've been brought to the edge of the promised land. Moses is giving his final instructions there. Deuteronomy chapter 8, picking up in verse 1. "You must carefully follow every command I am giving you so that you may live and increase and may enter and take possession of the land the Lord swore to your fathers. Remember that the Lord your God led you on the entire journey, these 40 years in the wilderness, so that he might humble you and test you to know what was in your heart, whether or not you would keep his commands. He humbled you by letting you go hungry. Then he gave you manna to eat, which you and your fathers had not known, so that you might learn that man does not live on bread alone, but on every word that comes from the mouth of the Lord." And he'll continue to talk about their journey and how God has provided for them, not just in terms of clothing or in terms of food, but also in clothing and in protection and in provision throughout their journey. But the most important phrase here, I think, is so that you might learn that man does not live on bread alone, but by every word that comes from the mouth of God. Now, this probably sounds familiar to us because this is the first argument that Jesus refutes Satan with when he's tempted in the wilderness to turn the stones into bread. And Jesus' point there, as Moses' point is here, is the bread has nothing to do with it. Trust in God is what it is. And so in both passages we've just read, God says, I am humbling you and I am testing you. Now, I think we need to see the difference between a test and a temptation. If we're going to bring in that Matthew 4 passage. A temptation is something that someone wants you to fail. A test is something that someone wants you to succeed. And so when God is doing this to them, he wants his communities to succeed so that they can learn to trust him. And so that their dependence on him, their knowledge of him, and their relationship with him can grow stronger and stronger and stronger. Now, we see how that plays out in the Old Testament. So with all of that in mind, let's go back to John 6. John chapter 6. If you recall, last week we talked about the beginning of this chapter, which is Jesus feeding the 5,000. So Jesus is out in a wilderness area. He goes up on a mountain. A community of people comes to him. They're hungry. He provides bread for them free of charge, as much as they can eat, more than they could possibly eat, so that they have to gather up the remains of it. So we can see the similarities to the Exodus story, can't we? Okay, so Jesus then has the disciples dismiss the people. The disciples go across the sea on the boat. This is the account of Jesus walking out on the water to them. And now they have come to the other side. And that's where we'll pick up this morning. So we're going to begin in verse 22 of John 6. On the next day, the crowd that remained on the other side of the sea saw that there had been only one boat there, and that Jesus had not entered the boat with his disciples, but that his disciples had gone away alone. Other boats from Tiberias came near to the place where they had eaten the bread after the Lord had given thanks. So when the crowd saw that Jesus was not there, nor his disciples, they themselves got into the boats and went to Capernaum seeking Jesus. When they found him on the other side of the sea, they said to him, "Rabbi, when did you come here?" Jesus answered them, "Truly, truly, I say to you, you are seeking me, not because you saw signs, but because you ate your fill of the loaves." Let's pause there for just a moment. Okay, so our setting here now is across the Sea of Galilee. Jesus is now in Capernaum, which, if you're looking at a map, is on the north end of the Sea of Galilee. So it kind of makes that kind of rhombus shape. It's at that northern point in the rhombus shape. And so what we see at the end of this chapter is Jesus is most likely in the synagogue at Capernaum. And so the people have come and they found him. They're listening to him. He's been teaching in there. And they get there and they can't figure out how he got there, because the only boat they saw that made it across the sea didn't have him in it. So they ask, "Rabbi, when did you come here?" I mean, it's a good question. Like, how did you do this? But Jesus doesn't waste any time. He gets right to, if you'll pardon the expression, the heart of the matter, because he knows their hearts and he displays his knowledge of their hearts. "You are looking for me, verse 26, not because you saw signs." That word signs we've seen many times in the book of John, and we'll continue to see it. Remember, we've said signs are meant to point to something or direct someone towards something. And so Jesus says, you're not looking for me because you have any premonition about finding out what these signs mean or any of those things. You're looking for me because you got bread, because you got filled. Okay, now this is kind of interesting because remember when they originally came to him on the mountain at the beginning of chapter 6, verse 2, it says they were following him because they saw the signs he was performing on the sick. So they were genuinely curious when he came to them. He teaches them all day. He feeds them. And now they've come back to him. And Jesus says, I know why you're here. It doesn't have anything to do with the signs anymore. It has to do with the fact that you were physically filled. He gave them something for free, and now they've come back for more. However, Jesus' miracles, what are those signs meant to point to? The miracles are meant to point to the authenticity of his claim to be the Son of God, not just to point out that he could provide temporary physical benefits. Yes, this is somewhat of an act of benevolence, right? These people are hungry. They're out in on the mountain with him. It would be difficult for them to go get food. So this is a benevolent act on Jesus' part. But just like all of Jesus' benevolent acts, there's a point to it. And they need to be able to see the point. And that's what the rest of this conversation is going to deal with. Yes?
If we could make a quick small point there, but I think it's kind of important in practical application.
Sure.
We often see people, in our lives, come in contact with people who have various needs.
Right.
When you look at the pattern of Jesus, when these people came seeking spiritual food, he also took care of their physical needs.
Right.
But when they came seeking physical food, instead of the spiritual, there's not a crumb coming their way.
That's right.
And there's a clear message that we need to keep in mind also. We're not going to bring people to heaven by feeding.
Right.
And that's something that Jesus is showing us.
Right. Right. And that's true. We are not going to bring people to heaven by feeding them. However, we do still have an obligation to meet need where we see it in the best way that we can. But if you'll notice in that account, and it's a very, very small detail that I think we'll skip over. You notice when Jesus breaks the bread to give it to give to the disciples, to give to the people, what does he do before he breaks the bread? He blesses it and he gives thanks. He gives thanks for it. And so Jesus acknowledges at the beginning of that miracle where that bread is coming from. And so that goes right back to that meaning in Exodus, doesn't it? That man does not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes from the mouth of God. This is coming from God. And so that's going to be Jesus' point. And the whole point of all of this, he's going to say, is to point back to God. Now, consider what's being said here, what Jesus is saying in light of the ill-fated attitudes of the children of Israel concerning that manna in the wilderness that we just read. Moses reminded them in Deuteronomy 8 what the purpose of that manna was, that they would learn to trust in God. And so in light of where this conversation is headed, Jesus is very much aware of that connection. Nobody's mentioned Moses or wilderness wanderings or bread or any of that stuff yet in terms of making connections to the Old Testament. As a matter of fact, it's not even going to be Jesus that initiates that connection, but he knows where this is going. And I think this is all deliberate on his part. And I think John sees this because that's what's going to be, just kind of as a side note, as we're transitioning into the next part of John. And I'm just going to say, we're not going to get through chapter 7 today. We're just going to get through chapter 6 and call it a quarter. And then Dan will pick that up next time. But what we're seeing here is a series of feast days. So John's narrative is connected around these feast days. And in particular, in this part of John, remember the beginning of this, where Jesus feeds those 5,000, it says this is around the time of the Passover. So you automatically have bread connections there. And then bringing them out into the wilderness, the children of Israel out into the wilderness, he provides bread for them. And the very next chapter, what we're going to see in chapter 7 is 6 months after this, they have come to the time of the Feast of Tabernacles, or the Feast of Booths. Now, does anyone remember what the Feast of Booths is connected with? What is that feast meant to do? Okay, it's meant to be a feast that reminds them of the harvest and reminds them of the wilderness wanderings. So they lived out in the desert in booths. And so this festival is supposed to be a time when they remember that and they appreciate that. And in Jewish culture at this time, the Festival of Booths had become a very big festival, as we'll see in John 7 and 8. had become a very big deal. So we could equate it to probably our Thanksgiving, a time when we take off of work, we go with our, to be with our families. We have all these traditions associated with it and all of that. And so John is making connections between those feast days, the times of remembrance, and the narrative of what's happening. So these connections back to Exodus are very much intentional. And we've got to see those to truly appreciate what it is that Jesus is trying to teach. So Jesus, getting back to our narrative here, verse 27, Jesus says, "Do not work for the food that perishes, but for the food that endures to eternal life, which the Son of Man will give to you. For on him the Father has set his seal." Okay, so we read about this kind of had this dichotomy here between the food that perishes and the food that endures to eternal life. And what's the difference between these? Jesus hasn't really extrapolated that a whole lot just yet. But doesn't this sound like we're kind of catching glimpses of the same type of conversation that Jesus had with the Samaritan woman, where he's talking about something physical that's connected back to the forefathers, and she's just not quite getting it? And remember, that's kind of been the pattern in John, is that Jesus has an initial interaction with somebody, and then he speaks to them. They don't understand it. He clarifies and then expounds on that. And the lesson, as we say, is yours from John. So in terms of the Samaritan woman, physical water would only quench physical thirst. It's all temporary. And in this case, physical food will only temporarily solve physical hunger. And so, if we really want to kind of put this in a larger context, doesn't this apply to many things? I mean, we always want things. That's just kind of the nature of humanity, right? We always want more. And so we always think, well, if I only had A, then I would be happy. If I only had B, I would be content, and I wouldn't need anything else. Money, possessions, relationships, knowledge, all the things you can think of, physical intimacy, we will always want more. And when we get the thing that we always said that we wanted, there's going to be a time when we're either going to want more of that thing because it ran out, or we're just going to want something else. It makes me think back to the Old Testament of, I forget which of David's sons, but he wanted a woman so badly, and he finally got her. He got her through illicit means, but he finally got her, and once he got what he wanted, he had no love for her anymore. He was done. Okay, so this is the type of thing. And what he said in that instance was, if I don't have her, I will die. And he got what he wanted, and he dropped her like a bad habit. Okay, so we will always want more, and Jesus knows that. Spiritual thirst, though, and spiritual hunger, which is what Jesus is ultimately getting to, though, can only be solved in one way, and that is coming to Jesus. That existential ache that's within all of us. This is that Ecclesiastes concept, right? Where we've got whatever we wanted, every single thing that we wanted, and still there's just a hole inside of us. And it's often been referred to as a God-shaped hole, right? That the only thing that can fill that God-shaped hole is God. The only thing that can fill that Jesus-shaped hole is Jesus. And so all of us have that. It's this kind of constant inward longing that we all have. And the only way that each one of us is going to be filled is by seeking the one whose image that we bear. And so Jesus is going to talk about that. On him, God the Father has set his seal. And we might kind of glance over that statement and say, well, that's just a seal of approval, like USDA meat or something like that. Remember, the seal, in some form or fashion, bears an image of the one that's granting the authority, in many cases, the king, right? And so when we see that for on him, God the Father has set his seal, yes, it is about authority, but it's also about resembling the one who set that seal. Okay? So we will always want more. And the thing is he has promised to give it to us because the Father has given him the authority to do it. In the face of our sin and our disbelief, just like the children of Israel, God could withhold any semblance of salvation, any semblance of satisfaction. God did not have to feed the children of Israel out in the wilderness. He could have done whatever he wanted to with them. And yet, in the face of their grumbling, he enthusiastically provides the solution. He does it out of love. And he does the same thing for all of us through Jesus. He already said in John 3:16, for God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten son. And he always had a plan to do so even before the first rebellion was committed. Ephesians 1:11, before the world began. Okay? So do not work for the food that perishes, work for the food that endures to eternal life. Okay, so now Jesus has made this statement about work, right? So in their minds, they're thinking, all right, so now we got a job ahead of us. Let's get that task over with so that we can get back to the bread. So they asked this question then, verse 28. They said to him, what must we do to be doing the works of God? What do we got to do? The crowd doesn't get the reality just yet. They're looking for a magic formula. And, you kind of see the similarities in that. What must I do? What must we do? That'll be a question that we see in some other areas. So what's the quest we have to undertake? What's the job we have to accomplish? What are the credentials that we have to get this to get this benefit? Again, verse 29, Jesus answers them. This is the work of God, that you believe in him whom he has sent. So Jesus introduces them to the paradox of that work that they need to accomplish. It's not work. You're thinking you're going to have to undertake some sort of task or check some sort of box. There's no magic formula, Jesus says. To kind of quote the Stevie Wonder song, here I am, signed, sealed, delivered. I'm yours. Believe me. That's all you've got to do. This is the work of God, that you believe in him whom he has sent. Okay, so verse 30 then. So they said to him, then what sign do you do that we may see and believe you? What work do you perform? Now, if I'm Jesus at this point, I am completely dumbfounded. I am exasperated beyond all measure. Now, it may be that some of the people that Jesus is speaking to right now were not on the mountain. But many of the people that are, because this is the crowd that has come to him, seeking him. And surely even those who were not there are getting word about this miracle. Word is spreading as the people are coming in and talking about it. So if I were Jesus, I would just be completely dumbfounded. Thankfully, though, I'm not Jesus. Jesus displays great patience here in his reply. And I often kind of wonder if this might inspire Peter's later thought, the Lord is patient with you, not wanting anyone to perish. I wonder if maybe Jesus is kind of saying to himself over and over again, the Lord is patient with you. The Lord is patient with you. The Lord is patient with you. Because I know that's how I would be thinking. But verse 31 then, they say to him, continuing this argument, our fathers ate the manna in the wilderness. As it is written, he gave them bread from heaven to eat. Oh, they're using scripture now. Hey, good job. Okay, so they're trying to persuade him to repeat the previous miracle by using scripture to get him to perform for them. Now, we have already seen someone use scripture to try to get Jesus to perform something for them, and that didn't turn out too well for that individual. I don't quite think they're at that level yet. I don't think their purposes are necessarily nefarious as much as they're just not getting it yet. Now, it's possible they could be quoting a number of scriptures here. It's possible that they were quoting Exodus 16:4, which we just read, where God does say that he's going to rain down bread from heaven for them. There are also two Psalms that use this same phrase. One is Psalm 78, verse 24, and the other is Psalm 105, verses 40 and 41. For right now, I want to focus on that first one. Psalm 78, if this is the one that they are quoting, there's a certain irony to them using this psalm. Because Psalm 78 is a psalm about people who continually ignore signs that God is sending to them so that they would trust in him. And the eventual outcome of it is that God will rain down bread from heaven for them and that he will call them to himself. Despite their continual disbelief, God then ultimately in that psalm, he says in Psalm 78, verses 70 through 72, God will send his servant David to shepherd them and guide them with his skillful hand. So this is obviously a messianic psalm. So in reality, what they've done is, in using this kind of ironic reference to a psalm that really more indicts them than bolsters their argument, they've set Jesus up perfectly for the next part of this lesson. So Jesus, 32, picks up on this. Jesus then says to them, in answer to this, truly, truly, I say to you, it was not Moses who gave you the bread from heaven, but my Father gives you the true bread from heaven. For the bread of God is he who comes down from heaven and gives life to the world. So back to Deuteronomy chapter 8 again. Moses says he gave you manna to eat so that you might learn that man does not live by bread alone, but on every word that comes from the mouth of God. Moses did not provide the bread. He points back to God and says that God provided this. And what we know ultimately is, and what we're seeing here is, God providing that bread for them did meet an immediate need, but it's also for us a shadow of something to come. Eddie.
Jesus changes the pronouns here.
Oh,
They
okay.
said, our Father
Uh-huh.
received this bread from Moses. Jesus changed it and said, it was not Moses that gave you the bread instead of the Father's.
Okay.
Making the point that this is something that still continues to this day, but it's not the physical.
Yes. My Father gives you, present tense. Very good. Yeah. My Father gives you the true bread from heaven. So it is a continuing act. Yes. Very good. I didn't see that connection in the pronouns. But how he refers to this bread now that's being given, he refers to it as true bread or real bread. So this is a word, alethinos. It's used 23 times in John's writings. I'm not sure if he uses it the most, but it certainly is prolific, not just in the gospel, but in his other writings as well. The meaning of this word is that which is not only the name and the semblance of a thing, so the kind of the outside, the tangible aspects, but it's the real nature corresponding to that name. And so we'll often refer to things in either a metaphorical sense or in kind of a larger sense, but this is the thing. This is the thing itself. And so kind of continuing that definition, it contrasts the realities with their semblances. So this is what the book of Hebrews is all about. You had signs, you had shadows of what was to come. Now this is the thing that's casting that shadow. This is the light that's casting that shadow. And that's the whole point of John 1 there. This is the reality. You have never seen the Father, but the Son will show you the Father. And that's Jesus' point here as well. So he says then about this bread that it's not just the true bread from heaven, but what does this bread do? It comes down from heaven in terms of himself. The bread of God is he who comes down from heaven and gives life to the world. Now, I think this is really interesting because speaking in terms of changing terminology, the bread that was given in the wilderness, who did it feed? It fed Israel. It fed one nation, one family, one community of people. But what Jesus says is this true bread is to feed the world. This is for everyone. Okay, so he's bringing this point out much larger. So they say to him, and again, we're going back to shades of the Samaritan woman at the well. They said to him, verse 34, give us this bread always. Hey, you got this bread that gives life and you're willing to give it to us always. We're here for it. We are here for you. So still a physical request, similar to the Samaritan woman's. Give me this water so I don't have to keep coming to this well. Give us this food so we don't have to keep going and buying food over and over again. And we're yours. We're all your people now. Jesus says to them, though, I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me shall not hunger, and whoever believes in me shall never thirst. But I said to you that you have seen me and yet do not believe. So Jesus is dispelling any idea, any notion that he's talking about physical bread. This request, give us this bread always, is still talking about just regular bread. And Jesus is like, guys, zero in here. Let me underline this for you. I am the bread of life. So this is the first of those I am statements in John, the 7 major I am statements in John. No one who comes to me will ever be hungry, and no one who believes in me will ever be thirsty again. You have seen and yet do not believe. So the connections there that John has been drawing this whole time between seeing Jesus, experiencing Jesus, then coming to Jesus and believing in Jesus. Thematic throughout all of John is going to be the culmination of this chapter. You know, you refer back to verse 30 there. They ask him the question, what sign will you do that we may see and believe? So they're saying, hey, this is on you, Jesus. You got to prove yourself to us. Now, has he proven himself to them over and over and over again at this point? Yeah. You're standing here because I did something. So this question or this demand of what sign are you going to do that we might see and believe? The idea is that Jesus is going to have to keep performing greater and greater and greater signs in order for them to sustain belief. And the minute he stops doing that, so does their belief. And that's a problem. That's a very big problem. Okay? So if they're not seeing things on that spiritual level, they will never see what it is that Jesus is going to do for them. Verse 37, all the Father gives me will come to me, and whoever comes to me, I will never cast out. So not only did the Father give the Son for everyone, as we just said in 3:16, God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son so that the world might believe, but he also gives every believer to the Son. So in one sense, the Son was given to us, but we as believers are given to the Son. The Son is a gift to us to solve a problem that we can't. We cannot ultimately solve the problem of sin. We cannot ultimately solve the problem of the consequences of sin. That's why the Son was given to us. But believers, though, as we come to him, as we trust that he was sent for us and that he was given for us, and trust that he is doing what he said he was going to do and what the Father sent him to do, we are then the Son's inheritance. And so when he comes into his own, and eventually when he brings all of us to him, we are the inheritance that he is promised. Again, we read about that Ephesians 1:11. And the Son has no intention of despising that inheritance. Or as Jesus says, whoever comes to me, I will never cast out. I will not despise this inheritance. I recognize that this comes from the Father, and it is of great importance to me. Verse 38, why? For I have come down from heaven, not to do my own will, but the will of him who sent me. And this is the will of him who sent me, that I should lose nothing of all that he has given me, but raise it up on the last day. For this is the will of my Father, that everyone who looks on the Son and believes in him should have eternal life, and I will raise him up on the last day. So we're going back all the way to John chapter 3 then. Remember, he's talking to Nicodemus about the Son being raised up just as the serpent was lifted up in the desert. And that anyone who looked on that serpent could be saved from the thing that was afflicting them, which in that case was poisonous snake bites. And they had no solution for that problem, but to look to the thing that God provided for them. And so Jesus says then, as you look up to me, and I have been lifted up, you too will one day be lifted up with me. And again, we can read all about that in the book of Ephesians. He lifts us up to be with him in the heavenly places, Ephesians chapter 2. So Jesus continues to underline that his purpose, his will, his job is completely consistent with the Father. John 4:34, my food is to do the will of him who sent me. John 3:17, God sent his son so that the world might be saved through him. The Father's will and the Son's mission are exactly the same, and that is the redemption of mankind. For God so loved. So, what's their reaction to it? Jesus has just said, hey, you can have true fulfillment if you will just believe. That's all you got to do. You just got to believe. Verse 41. So the Jews grumbled about it. So the Jews grumbled about him because he said, I am the bread that came down from heaven. They said, is this not Jesus, the son of Joseph, whose father and mother we know? How does he now say, I have come down from heaven? Okay? That word there in your text, it may say complained, it may say, I think grumbled is a really good translation of that word. Because if you go back and look in the Septuagint version of the Old Testament, it's the exact same word that's used of the children of Israel in the desert. The exact same word. The whole congregation, Exodus 16:2, the whole congregation grumbled against Moses and Aaron. And so they asked this question then, isn't this Jesus, the son of Joseph, whose father and mother we know? And that word know, remember we said there's a big difference between the two versions of know or knowledge that John uses. There's eidos, which is just recognition. It's kind of surface level knowledge. And then there's gnosko or gnosis, which is deep knowledge of a thing because you are intensely connected to it. Okay, this is just that eidos. It's the recognition. Who we know, who we have seen and experienced and saw him grow up with. So again, we're coming back to the physical recognition. This is the region that Jesus grew up in. So these people know his family, they know his humble origins, they know who Jesus is. I mean, imagine we see one of the kids here that has, we've watched them grow up. We told them to stop running up and down the aisles after church because they might knock somebody over. And then they come back 20 years later and they're claiming to be the Son of God. I know this kid. I changed their diapers. I know this kid. Okay? So that's what they're saying. So Jesus answers them. I mean, Jesus is completely aware. Do not grumble among yourselves. Now, this is interesting because they're grumbling among themselves. They're talking to one another. The idea there is they're putting their heads together and kind of just quietly talking among themselves. Jesus is standing over here and he can point to him and say, stop grumbling. Stop that. Do not grumble among yourselves. No one can come to me unless the Father who sent me draws him. And I will raise him up on the last day. It is written in the prophets, and they will all be taught by God. Everyone who has heard and learned from the Father comes to me. Not that anyone has seen the Father, except he who is from God. He has seen the Father. So Jesus says, stop complaining among yourselves. The Father sent me, and he sent me to draw you. The whole purpose of me being here is, yes, to save you, but I've been walking among you this whole time, and I'm doing signs and walking among you now. And the purpose of that, rather than just cutting straight to the chase and getting right to the crucifixion and the resurrection, is so that you can see me, you can experience me, you can hear me, and establish a relationship with me and eventually to the Father as a result. Okay? The Father is using me to draw you. So the Father who sent me draws him. This is the same word that's used later on in this chapter, John chapter 21. After Jesus has been crucified, the disciples go out on the sea and they're casting their nets because they don't know what else to do. So they just revert back to what they did before. Well, Jesus is gone now, so we're just going to go fish. And so they're casting their nets out into the sea, and then they experience Jesus, and Jesus tells them, they hear the voice of Jesus, tell them, cast the nets out one more time, and then they haul in this great catch of fish. And it says they cannot draw the nets in. It's that same word. So the idea there, though, is, we think of a drag net and we think of, I just said the word, dragging something, but that's not the idea here. Instead of the idea of dragging, the idea is more so that believers are persuaded by the Father who has provided for them. If we're the fish and he's the net, we are gladly jumping into that net. Eddie.
And we see that in these two stories that we've been talking about. The Samaritan woman comes to Jesus and says, give me that water.
Mm-hmm.
These people are saying, give us that bread.
Mm-hmm.
Ultimately, that's the point of evangelism. We're not trying to drag people to the baptism.
Right.
What we're trying to do is to get them to desire to go there themselves.
Right. And that's Moses' point in Deuteronomy. He did all of these things to draw you to him. Now, they finally got him at Sinai, and the very first thing they said was, Moses, you got to go take care of this because we can't bear this. And that just becomes emblematic of their entire relationship with him throughout the wilderness. But yes, I mean, in the case of the Samaritan woman, here's Jesus. He has come to this woman at the well. He has presented himself. And then everything from there, he just casts that line. And she comes, and then she brings others. And that catch just gets larger and larger and larger. So believers are persuaded by the voice of the Father and the voice of a Father who has provided for them. And the Father has provided living bread so that, as we say in the South, they can come and get it. Okay, you smell that cornbread cooking, it's time. Right? So come and get it. Ultimately, though, those who are drawn to him on earth will also be drawn up into heaven with him on the last day. And this is the idea of Isaiah 54, which Jesus quotes here. In Isaiah 54, we don't have time to turn to read to it right now, but Israel is called by God as a wife is drawn to her husband. And he beckons her in that particular part of Isaiah. He beckons her, but she must heed his voice. She needs to hear him. She needs to come to know him. And what he says there is, when she does that, when she comes to him and is drawn by his voice, verse 13, all your children shall be taught by the Lord, and great shall be the peace of your children. In righteousness you shall be established. You shall be far from oppression, for you shall not fear. And you shall be far from terror, for it shall not come near you. This is the heritage, the end of that chapter. This is the heritage of the Lord's servants, and their righteousness is from me. So God is the source of all of this. He's the initiator of all of this. And so Jesus can say then, everyone who listens to the Father comes to me. If you're hearing his voice, my voice is the same. So similar to his answer then to Nicodemus, no one has ascended into heaven except the one who descended from heaven. Those who listen to the voice of the Father are going to look to the Son because he's the only one who has experienced the Father firsthand and who can reveal him to us. That's chapter 1 and verse 18. So Jesus says then, verse 47, truly, truly, I say to you, whoever believes has eternal life. I am the bread of life. Your fathers ate the manna in the wilderness and they died. This is the bread that comes down from heaven so that one may eat of it and not die. I am the living bread that came down from heaven. If anyone eats of this bread, he will live forever. And the bread that I will give for the life of the world is my flesh. Okay, now we're starting to get a little odd in this conversation in their estimation. Okay, so we've only got about 2 minutes left. Let me make this point. Jesus is obviously going to go on from here and talk about how you need to eat my flesh and drink my blood and do all these weird things. And I think he does this intentionally because he knows the connotation. Not only is this odd to any audience, he knows the connotations to a Jewish audience in particular. He's intentionally poking the bear here, but it's to make a point. And the question is, when we read this and we say, yeah, that is odd, we have to ask the question, what does that mean? And I found this last time and found it earlier. What does that mean, one author says? Think of it this way. Here in a bookcase is a book which a man has never read. It may contain the glory and the wonder of Shakespeare. But so long as it remains unread upon the bookshelf, it is external to him. One day he takes it down, he reads it. He is thrilled and fascinated and moved. The story sticks to him. The great lines remain in his memory. And now, when he wants, he can take that wonder out from inside himself and remember it and think about it and feed his mind and his heart upon it. Once the book was outside him. Now it's inside him, and he can feed upon it. It is that way with any great experience in life. It remains external until we take it within ourselves. It is so with Jesus. So long as he remains a figure in a book, he is external to us. But when he enters our hearts, we can feed upon the life and the strength and the dynamic vitality that he gives us. Jesus said that we must drink his blood. He is saying, you must stop thinking of me as a subject for theological debate. You must take me into you. You must come into me, and then you will have real life. That's what Jesus meant when he spoke about us abiding in him and himself abiding in us. When he told us to eat his flesh and drink his blood, he was telling us to feed our hearts and souls and minds on his humanity and to revitalize our lives with his life until we are filled with the life of God. He is the thing that fills that God-shaped hole and will always be. And he has given that thing to us free of charge. All we have to do is believe that it will do what he said it was going to do and that he is who he says he is. Okay, we're going to stop there. I appreciate all of your comments and kind attention this quarter, and Dan will pick up with John 7 next week. Thank you so much.